Hello and welcome to A Critical Dragon, where I talk about narrative in film, television, and in books. And today I am joined by my good friend, Dr. Philip Chase. Hello, Philip.
Hello, AP. How are you doing today?
Plotting ways to kill my nemesis.
Oh, that sounds very dire to me.
Why would it be dire to you? Are you my nemesis? Have you perchance been talking to other YouTubers without
I
me?
I have scorch marks on my tweed to prove that I am your nemesis. So let there be no doubt.
Well, I thought today we would have another chat about some of these Jungian archetypes, and I realized I made a big mistake when we did the first two videos. When I did my video and you did yours, didn't really introduce the whole concept of Jungian archetypes particularly well, did I?
That's on me too. So yeah, I will share the blame from. I will take some of the blame from you, my nemesis. So
Um,
yeah.
so what I thought I would do in this one, instead of looking specifically at the archetypes, we'd have a bit of a chat about the ones that we've already covered, but some of the concepts behind the archetypes, because it just would be good to clear the air a little bit and make it a wee bit clear, because we sometimes assume things are general knowledge when they're not. And particularly when we're taking something like a Jungian archetype, so from psychiatry and psychotherapy and psychoanalysis, and then we've translated it into the literary archetypes that people used the Jungian archetypes for, and then we've moved it again into fantasy. We're already steps removed from the core concept. And when we combine the idea of an archetype with discussions of characters that we were using as illustrations, then there can be not necessarily confusion, but a blurring of the edges of what we're trying to discuss. So the first thing I think to clear up would be, yes, Jung created these archetypes, and quite often the language used to describe them is male. That does not mean that these are male archetypes. It's not that this is male Jungian archetypes and then female Jungian archetypes. You can do that. You can go through and use, and people have done, instead of magician, used witch, or instead of sage, used crone. And the reason I didn't do that is I think a lot of what you would typically call female terminology, these female archetypes, have a certain pejorative history attached to them that
Right.
shouldn't be there. And it's why when we were discussing the archetypes, even though you may have thought magician male and then witch would be the female version,
Right.
magician is the idea of the intellect. And I think we use Galadriel as an example of that
Hmm.
Galadriel as magician. And I have no problem. I don't see any distinction. This is not a gendered thing about their core type personality, their core trait. That applies
Right.
equally to men and women and everything in between.
Yeah.
So that was the first thing I kind of wanted to raise, because I don't know about you, when people say witch, and it gets used in a lot of different contexts, but it's very hard to overcome, particularly in a Western discussion,
Yes.
the Christian demonization of what witch means or warlock. Both have negative connotations, whether unconscious or conscious bias associated with them. So
Yeah.
that's
One,
why I
one
didn't want to
interesting,
use those terms.
yeah. So one interesting point in regard to that is that witch and wizard have exactly the same root, which is related to the word wit, but because of the patriarchal culture from which our language emerged, and of course, language also reinforces cultural tendencies as well, because your language is your way of seeing the world. Because of all this, the word witch took on very negative connotations, whereas the word wizard, you think of Gandalf, you think of Merlin, you think of something more positive normally. These are the connotations that these things have taken on, and this happens in even contexts that seem more innocent, perhaps at first glance. You mentioned before we started recording how you use the word actor to refer to both a male actor and a female actor, because the I think growing archaic word actress perhaps does convey something to, at least perhaps to some minds, something lesser perhaps than the word actor, which could be applied to both. Why not?
Well, and the thing is, actor, they are both acting.
Yeah.
Acting is the job. The person who acts is an actor. That's
Right.
the derivation of the word. So it doesn't matter what gender someone is or what sex someone is in order to act. They are both actors.
Yep.
And it was a very interesting thing because political correctness gets a lot of bad rep. But a lot of the concept behind political correctness was to avoid that sort of one is the important one and one is lesser, where particularly the and you see it sometimes in other languages where there's a feminine ending, it is weaker, it is lesser. So that was instead of a woman police officer, you go or sorry, policewoman, policeman, policewoman, and you go, but they're both police officers. So you can see that's why it was added in, because we shouldn't be distinguishing in terms of their, regardless of how you feel about the police, but in regard to the job that they are doing the same job, so they should have the same title. And that's the simple basis behind it. Can it be taken to extremes? Yes.
Yeah, of course.
It's an interesting way, because as soon as you start using sort of non-gendered language to think about the concepts, you actually think about the concepts, I think, a lot more clearly.
Yeah.
But that's a personal thing. But about witch, the word witch, I'm melting. That has become such a popular image of what a witch is. The green skin, the big nose, the hat.
And everything, yeah.
So you can see why, trying to avoid that in discussing the archetypal concept of intelligence, and you go, oh, we could call it magician and then witch, and you go, it doesn't, because of the other connotations of the word, it doesn't really work that way. But this is a long-winded way of saying, when we're discussing these archetypes, it's the concept, and the concept isn't gendered.
Right, absolutely agree. Also, just a different point that I want to make really quickly. Jungian archetypes are one thing, and we're going to be talking about them specifically today. But I think it's perfectly fine to have a broader understanding of the word archetype as well. That when we say archetype now, we include many categories that Jung didn't talk about, and that is perfectly fine. In fact, you and I may end up talking about some of those beyond just the Jungian archetypes. But for now, we're going to address the Jungian archetypes. And
this came up in our discussion the other day, because we were talking a bit about the trickster, and obviously the trickster as an archetype, it goes beyond, far beyond, and started far before Jung. The trickster is a mythological archetype, and we could say the same about the maid, the mother, and the crone. These are all archetypes from various cultures and pasts and mythologies and religions and different cultures that have all been brought in together. We can talk about them as archetypes, but it's a series of videos. They have to start somewhere. We have to work our way through the material, and we can't do all of them all at once. So that's why we started with Jung, because the Jungian archetypes do get used as literary archetypes. And one of the things that's actually quite interesting is with Jung, and I thought my original conception of this is we would talk through the archetypes and then we would do the shadow archetypes. Yes, another mistake that I made. The shadow archetypes are really the dark mirrors, the evil, or the darker, or the less positive, the negative versions of the ones that we're talking about, because the archetypes, the initial conception of the archetype, are the positive ones. And that's what we were working through, the positive ones. And then there's the shadow archetypes. So what I thought I'd do is I found this very handy diagram online, because we all know my skills at making diagrams suck. But I have stolen someone else's. Well, not stolen. I have borrowed for educational purposes, because it's fair use, so that we can talk through this. So I'll share that on the screen now, and Philip and I will have a bit of a chat about this, and we will relate the sort of the shadow archetypes in a discussion of the ones that we've already covered on my channel and his.
Cool. So if we're just borrowing it, do we have to give it back when we're done?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. By the way, you made a really nice triangle diagram. That was really good. Your triangle. I was impressed. It's way beyond anything I could do. So
Yes, I made a triangle. That is as sophisticated as my graphic design skills get. Right. So, shadow archetypes. So you can see on this, what they've done is they put the good archetypes, the Jungian archetypes that we were discussing, are on the outside. And then on the inside is the shadow archetypes. And really, they are reflections, dark reflections of the sort of the core concept that is being investigated or being articulated in this particular version. And by the way, there are multiple different versions and interpretations of Jungian archetypes. It's not that there's just one. This has been developed over, what is it, about 90 years now? Yeah. There's been a lot of development of Jungian archetypes and playing around with it and different variants of it. This is just one more variant. So if you look at the bottom there, where we have magician, and then it goes into trickster. And the reason I'm starting with this is one I disagree with, because trickster to me is a very different archetype. It is coming from a very different background, and it's not really reflected in how we discussed magician. And so if we look at magician and sage, here they have sage versus elitist as the dark version. So when we discussed sage, we discussed it in terms of wisdom, not in terms of knowledge. And with magician, we discussed magician in terms of knowledge, of intelligence.
Yeah.
So that's the slight change I would make to this if I had the ability to edit pictures.
Yeah, so, I would agree with you, certainly when it comes to sage, and I would change knowledge to wisdom there. And for magician, it makes a lot more sense to have knowledge there. I can see where whoever made this is juxtaposing the magician to the trickster, and you can see the label good archetypes for the ones on the outside, and then there's the ones on the inside that are shaded, are the shadow archetypes. So I'm assuming that there's a kind of a binary here that is being introduced, good and evil, I guess. And I would assume that this is in terms of applying this to characters, and of course to real life, it's a whole lot more complex, but it's a useful diagram. I can see where trickster could be juxtaposed to magician, in the sense of using knowledge in different ways. So a magician would be using it more helpfully, whereas a trickster would be wreaking havoc, causing chaos, that sort of thing.
Yeah, and I don't necessarily disagree with that. It's just I think that trickster as an archetype is actually a video all on its own, because trickster, the trickster figure is absolutely fascinating, particularly because tricksters appear in mythologies and legends and religions across the world at all these different time periods. It's a core concept, and it seems a shame that it's been in this particular thing relegated to the shadow of the magician. But in a lot of ways, you know, I can understand it. It kind of makes sense that with one dimension of trickster, which is if a magician is using intellect to guide, trickster is using intellect to fool, to confuse, to obfuscate. So the magician is using their intellect to provide knowledge and enlightenment in that sense. And the trickster is using it to guile people, to trick them, to fool them, and therefore hide things from them. So you can see it's a nice way of thinking about that binary dynamic as a concept.
Yeah.
But when obviously we apply it to characters, as we have said in the other videos, characters are generally much more complex than a simple one core aspect. While we have used them to illustrate things, the characters generally are more sophisticated than that. But we're trying to identify things that you look at and go, oh, I know the type of character you're talking about, rather than you've just said that they're only that one thing. That's not what we're doing. It's a way to illustrate what we're talking about, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And our viewers came up with some really great examples beyond the ones that we came up with. And you know, as far as trickster goes, you have, we mentioned Loki, who actually is both male and female, and in the stories. But yeah, there's loads of examples of great magicians and and sages, and of course from the second video we made, we had lots of, we'll talk about jesters. I don't see, I was looking for a rogue here and I don't see a rogue anywhere. Where would that have fit? I
Outlaw. So
oh,
they've
yeah.
used the
Okay,
term
outlaw.
outlaw,
Yeah.
and this is actually a really interesting juxtaposition because they have outlaw versus criminal.
Yeah.
So when we
Huh.
talked about the rogue as Robin Hood, Robin Hood was an outlaw, so outside of the law, whereas they've put the binary opposition in there as criminal, someone who has committed a crime, who is evil, who has done something wrong. So you can see there's a moral judgment being applied there in the two terms about how you refer to essentially the same act. One that's
Yeah.
outside the law, i.e., not obeying the law, the other that is breaking the law. And it's that slight emphasis, that slight change of perspective. And
Yeah, like you
this is
said
what we
before, there's the what I think when you use the D&D, and you were talking about chaotic good versus chaotic evil. This is the difference here, right? You have this people who break the law. If we like them, they're outlaws, and if we don't like them and they're nasty, they're criminals. So,
and and again, like using the D&D alignment chart, and you know, a lot of RPGs have their variants of it, but using something like that, I know players use it for character generation, but sometimes it's a useful diagnostic tool. It's a useful
yeah.
way of applying a breakdown of a character to try to get to core traits, to try to break the character apart, because characters are complex, characters have nuance. And sometimes stripping that away to find core elements helps you understand the character a bit more. And it's obviously something I have a lot of affinity with because of narratology and structuralism, which, you know, obviously I'm a fan of. But
Yep.
by seeing the parts, that helps you identify a whole bunch of things. But of course, like the big takeaway from it is characters are always more than the sum of their parts. So you have to put them back together again. And, you know, like Humpty Dumpty. But what I thought was interesting here was the sage, this idea of knowledge, and where we would have used wisdom, versus the elitist. So the sage wants to give out their wisdom, their knowledge to help to raise everyone else up. Whereas the elitist uses that same knowledge to elevate the self and not other people. So you can see part of what's going on here in terms of what they've labeled good archetypes and shadow is one is more egotistical and self-centered, and for the was it the id? I always get these. Is it the id? I always get id and ego confused.
So the id is the naughty part is the id. Yeah.
But because it's id, ego, and super ego, and to be perfectly honest, it's been a long time since I studied them. But
yeah, so the ego is like the self, I think, and the id is the naughty, the one that wants to eat too many cookies, and the super ego is the too many cookies are bad for you. So that's the super ego.
well, what we see for the shadow archetypes, rather than being evil, quite often they are the selfish version.
Yeah.
And the good archetypes are the more benevolent or caring, or not necessarily good, but thinking of others.
Yeah.
And again, it's looking at this diagram. We're not saying you have to follow this diagram. It's thinking about the concepts in the diagram and thinking about how that gives us a different way of thinking about characters. So I never would, if someone had asked me what the opposite of a sage was, where I'm thinking, oh, it's all about wisdom, and you go, well, maybe it's the fool or the stupid person, and they go, no, because that's not the concept. The concept for the sage is using wisdom to guide, and the other is using wisdom and intelligence to elevate the self and no one else, to be a gatekeeper, to be an elitist, to shut other people out. And you
Right.
go, that's a really interesting way of thinking about the core concepts of sage and magician. Are
Yeah.
they guiding people? Are they helping people? Are they helping themselves? Are they punishing other people? So you can see that movement, that juxtaposition.
Right. I think an interesting one there too, we haven't talked about yet, is the juxtaposition of jester and hater in the context of what you were just talking about. Whereas the jester, an example we did not talk about, but several of our viewers mentioned, is Kruppe. And I think it's a wonderful one. How did we miss the slippery fellow when we were talking about jesters? I don't know. But anyway, he is, I think in many ways fits the jester figure. And if we're talking about him as a good archetype, in that sense, he is definitely one who uses his abilities, his humor, his sleight of hand, if you will, in order to accomplish what I think most readers would agree are good ends, to help other people, to avert disaster, to, basically we feel like he's a character, even though he's kind of slimy, that is working for the good of all. Whereas it's opposite here, or it's what's being juxtaposed with it here is hater, and I find that interesting. And then I'm not so happy with the what do you call the words in the middle, where these are their
Sort of
quality,
the quality that they are the opposite, the other side. It's the coin that they are the sides of.
Okay, so pleasure being the coin. I'm not sure I'm happy with that.
Well,
but
and
Kruppe he does like his pastries, I guess.
well, part of it is how we were thinking about jesters, not necessarily how this person who designed this is thinking about jester, or even how other people have used jester. And
Yeah.
so to talk about Kruppe first before I go into this,
Yeah.
the reason I wouldn't have picked Kruppe to be a jester is Kruppe is the magician. He is the sage. He is hero. He is ruler. He is caregiver. He is all of these other things. Kruppe is extraordinarily complicated. And he's one of those characters that it is very hard to pin down a core concept at his heart, because he's the ill. But spoilers, Gardens of the Moon. I'm gonna have to put spoiler warnings all through this one again.
No, I don't think you have to.
This is your fault, Philip. Your fault.
This one's on you.
You brought up Kruppe. Right. Well, the cat's out of the bag here. So, but because Kruppe.
No, it's the eels out of the bag.
So because Kruppe has all of these different aspects to him, he is manipulative, he is intelligent, he is benevolent, but he's also a thief. So you get that sense of the outlaw. He's a thief in a fence. He is so complicated in those things that you can say that he is benevolent, that he is a good, morally sort of. Is he morally good? Because let's face it, he's still a thief. He still steals things.
Oh, but pastries and that sort of thing. I mean,
and it's not like he's stealing the pastries to give to the hungry. He's stealing the pastries to put them in his own mouth. So we have with Kruppe, is a perfect illustration of why archetypes aren't always the best way to try to define a character, because some characters will be blending so many archetypes that it becomes less useful. And you're probably better off looking at what it is that the character is doing and situating that context within the narrative, because that gives you a better idea. So talking about what Kruppe does within the narrative gives you a better sense of who he is than trying to break Kruppe's character apart and assign archetypes to it. But it can help focus that attention, or it can show that, oh, this is the wrong way to do it. Let's try a different technique. But to talk about the binary that they've suggested here, I think they're looking at Jester very much as someone who gives pleasure, gives humor, gives entertainment, whereas a hater is someone who's always trying to destroy, to remove enjoyment. So they're
Right.
someone who constantly criticizes because it makes them feel better to make you feel bad. Whereas a
Uh,
jester is telling jokes to cheer you up. And I think
yeah.
that's the dynamic that they're trying to explore with that binary.
Yeah, very nice. Okay, this is pretty cool. I mean, I love these kinds of things. This is a fun diagram and obviously conducive to some pretty interesting conversation. I'm not entirely sure about all the coin words and the white circle there, but I think it's definitely a diagram that captures a lot of what we mean by these archetypes. So I think our viewers will find it very interesting.
And just to return to some of the initial points that we were making is we're not I don't try to argue that these archetypes have a fixed definition, because remember, we're talking about psychoanalysis, we're talking about concepts, we're talking about these generalized terms, and even they, when you think about them, are culturally defined. What is wisdom? And depending on where you come from, you may have very different notions of what wisdom is.
Yeah.
But they are ways of helping us sharpen our focus, and they are ways of helping us articulate aspects of what it is that we want to talk about,
Mm.
um, without always having to go into very specific things and quote huge passages. That you can say, oh, it's this archetype, this is what I want to talk about and how it's being used. So I think hopefully that will clear up the mess that I made by not actually introducing any of this in the first video. Um, Philip, thank you
The
for.
mess, the mess we made, the mess we made. So,
Well, um, and for all of you who are still watching, thank you so much for watching, and we will see you in the next one.